Good morning, everyone. Goedemorgen. It's very nice to be here this morning. I am an academic, I'm a professor, I'm a researcher, and I've been working for the last 15 years or so in university leadership positions. I'd like to tell you a couple of stories from my sector, from the higher education sector, but I'd also like to share with you today some research results that I hope can be useful as you try to continue your own work in improving the gender balance and the gender balance work of your organizations. Let me start by telling you a story about an epiphany experience that I had. It's getting to be a while ago. It happened in 2002. I was sitting in my office one day and I got a phone call in the late afternoon from the woman who was the director of research at the institution I was working at then, which was the University of Tromsø. And my director said to me, "Curt, I can't tell you why, but at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, you have to be at a press conference in Oslo. So go home, pack a bag, get on a plane, and go show up at this press conference." Well, even though she couldn't tell me why, I had a pretty good idea of what was going on. The Norwegian government had made a big decision the year before. They had looked at Norwegian universities, they had looked at Norwegian research groups, they had looked at the amount of money that they were taking and sending to Brussels to be distributed, and they weren't seeing enough of that coming back. And they realized that there was a fundamental cultural problem in Norway. It wasn't a problem at that point about gender diversity, but maybe it was. But it was a problem about egalitarianism. The strongest cultural value in Norway is egalitarianism, and even when you're building a research sector and when you're putting together research groups, you think that you've succeeded best if everybody's about the same. But it turns out that in international competitions, that's not going to be good enough. So the government had made a change. They had decided to create something called centers of excellence, and centers of excellence would be groups that would get special conditions and should really lift themselves. And I had participated in that competition with some friends of mine, and it was about time for the results to be revealed, and then I got that phone call and I thought, yeah, we got one. So this is going to be 10 years of funding at a level you couldn't imagine. So I went home, I packed my bag, I got on a plane, and I went to Oslo, and I went to the university, and I went to the place where this press conference was supposed to be the next morning, and I walked into an auditorium. It was a huge auditorium with room for 800 people. And I thought, my God, why are they doing it here? This is after all, for researchers, who cares? And I walked into the auditorium and it was packed. I thought, wow, the people of Oslo are really into basic research. How fun is that? And then, as I looked, in the next 10 seconds around the room, I saw that it was full of children. And then I was really impressed with the people of Oslo. I thought, my God, they bring school kids to learn about research. Well, it turned out that there were actually two things happening, two awards that were going to be given at that press conference. One was to those of us, am I making it do that, or are you making it do that? I hope that's not. It must be some kind of woman's microphone here. It was really two events. It was the awarding of these so-called centers of excellence, and then it was also an award for kids. They have a competition that goes all year long in their schools. It's called the Nysgjerrig Per Award, the Curious Pete Award, and they do science competitions, and they were going to be revealed. And as if that weren't enough, not only was the minister there, but the Crown Prince was there. The Crown Prince was there for the kids, it turns out, and the minister was for us, but that was okay. So they decided to start with that. So the minister gets up there and she talks about how this is the biggest investment the Norwegian Research Council has ever made in research, and how these people here are the cream of the crop, and they're modern day Vikings being sent off to Brussels to grab the loot and bring it home. And now, please, could I invite the 13 new directors of the Centers of Excellence to come down and stand with me on the stage? So I got up, and I buttoned my jacket, and I walked down the stairs, and I lined up, and I looked down the row, and I looked up the row, and I thought to myself, where are the women? Because there we were, 13 of us, fixing our ties, buttoning our coats, and as if that weren't bad enough, my minister, a woman, then turned to address these 500 kids who were in the auditorium, and she said, "Here you are after a year of hard work learning to be scientists. Keep going, do well, the world is your stage. You too can be sent off to bring home the money from Brussels. Just look, your future is right here." And that I thought was embarrassing. I thought that was embarrassing. We were the picture of the future to those kids, she said, and it felt to me like we were some kind of stiff painting out of the past. And I thought about that. Well, what's going on? Who are we failing? We're not just failing the girls. Obviously, we're failing the girls. They're not seeing their role models there. But we're failing the boys, too. They're not going into workplaces that look like this. Right now, they're that 20-year-old generation being out-earned by the girls who were in their class. But Aviva's right. If you just wait a little longer, as it is right now, they're still going to take off and win. It's not good to think like that. So why is it like that? That group of heads of those centers was drawn from the pool of professors in Norway, which at that time was between 20 and 25% women. So why weren't there 3 or 4 women in that group? That's something that I thought about a lot, and I think about it in the nature of academic careers, and maybe it applies in your sector as well. Academic careers require massive self-promotion. You have to apply for a PhD position. That's already hard. You have to sell yourself into some professor's research group and be taken in there. You have to write articles and decide that they're good enough to be sent to a scientific journal. When you finish your PhD, you have to find a way to continue having a job. Most people go into a so-called postdoc position where they have had to arrange the funding for that themselves. Then they have to go again into a lab and engage in one of the most bizarre things in academia, which is fighting about the order of authors on scientific articles. And if you are a taxpayer and you live in a country with publicly funded universities, I can tell you that a lot of your tax money goes to funding those kinds of fights. People use a hell of a lot of time figuring out what order the authors are going to go in, and it's really important. So when you read hiring decisions and promotion decisions, people talk about, well, she has 7 first article authors. What am I doing here? I'm sorry, Ryan. I don't know what's happening. Okay, so it requires massive self-promotion to succeed at an academic career. And maybe that is a kind of something that's relevant for thinking about when we want to think about what kinds of cultural differences are important for men and women. So we have to try to figure this out. Where can we look to try and figure it out? We can listen to stories of the kinds that I'm telling, and I'm going to tell you one more. We can look at research. Both of those things are really important, right? Stories engage us, they help us understand that we want to do something differently. Research lets us know what's really going on. Those things get mixed up sometimes, right? How often have you heard somebody say, yeah, well, we had a woman president one time, but yeah, that didn't really work out, right? As though that's an argument for not having to continue to engage, just mixing stories and research. So we need to listen to stories, and we need to look at research. And I'd like to use a little bit of time on both of those things. First, I want to tell you a story about a project that I led at my university. That university was the worst in Norway when it came to the percentage of women professors. We have fewer than 10% women professors. 10 years ago, and then we engaged in a very deliberate process, and now are the best in the nation with about 35% women professors. And that was a result of, well, first of all, a lot of hard work on the part of a number of individual women, but it was also the result of a project that we did that I called the Promotion Project. And I'd like to just highlight a couple of features of that promotion project as an example of the kind of practices that one can look to. So for the promotion project, we identified a number of women who were within 2 or 3 years of being able to apply for promotion to full professor. And we asked them if they wanted to contribute to or participate in this project that we would do. We recruited them, we brought them together, and we did some training with them. And the training that we did with them was to, first of all, make very clear to them what the promotion process entailed. And then we did something that turned out to have a lot of value in the organization, and that was that we simulated that project. We actually had them put together a whole promotion portfolio. We sent it out to an external committee, just like we do in academia. We have this idea that we'll be unfair to our colleagues, so we send it out. They got reports back just like they would. They went into a process with their supervisors. They built career plans. We made money available for them to do what they needed to do. And actually about 80% of them got promoted within 5 years. The two things that were the most important in that project were the simulation and the work with their supervisors. Academia is so anarchistic that people often don't, sometimes if you ask a professor who their boss is, they'll say, well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, do I have a boss? I don't know if I have a boss, right? And the idea that departmental chairs at the head of a department at a university would engage in career planning with a professor in their department is actually quite foreign. But in this project, we trained department chairs to do career planning with the women in their department on the basis of that simulated promotion process. And the effect of that was super important because those chairs said, wow, this is the first time I've ever engaged in career planning with somebody who works for me. And now I do it with everyone. When I started thinking about gender equality work, I used to think if we could just make workplaces better, universities are such lousy workplaces, if we could just make them better for everyone, that would entail making them better for women. And for a while I believed that until I started really trying to work on it, and then I understood that that was exactly backwards. That what happens is if we make an investment in making the workplace better for women, we'll make it better for everyone. And that project was an example of that. Things that we started out doing to make better for women ended up making the workplace something better for everyone. So that's one kind of a story that we might tell. I think it emphasizes part of the topic that we're talking about today, that if we start out thinking differently about the needs of men and women, we can end up in a situation that's actually better for the whole organization. But I'd like to use the rest of my time just to touch very briefly on a few related kinds of research articles. And I am going to have to ask the timekeeper. Fine. Yeah, you think I'm fine. You don't know how much I have here. Okay. What I want to tell you is this. I still have 20 minutes, okay. Then I can touch on some important stuff here. And research suggests to us that we can learn a lot about hiring processes, evaluation processes, promotion processes, and we can understand better the ways that we do and don't treat women similarly and differently. And that research takes basically two possible forms. Some researchers look at actual processes and try to extract generalizations from documentation of actual processes. Other researchers try to simulate various aspects of the career path and do so-called controlled studies of those kinds of situations. So we have a research literature that has those two different kinds of approaches. Let me give you a sample of each one of those. One kind of controlled study is where you, for example, you make up a CV, a resume of a hypothetical employee. And one example of this that got a lot of attention a couple of years ago was also from academia, where people made a CV of somebody who would apply to be the head of a lab. And then they sent that CV out to several hundred professors, and they said, would you hire this person? If you would, how much would you pay them? If they need mentoring, would you give them mentoring? Do you think they would fit into your group? They sent the exact same CV out to several hundred professors with one difference. Sometimes at the top it said John, and sometimes at the top it said Jennifer. Okay. thing. And you know the story here. The story is that John was much more likely than Jennifer to be offered a position. When Jennifer was hired, she was offered about 80% of the salary that John was offered. They weren't so happy to have to mentor Jennifer. The only thing Jennifer had going for her was that they liked her better. Okay, that's a simulation. There was no real John or real Jennifer. It's where you try to control for everything. You make the resumes look exactly the same, and then see if you can extract some information. By the way, one thing that's extremely important to note about that study is that there was no difference between the men and the women who were doing the hiring. So women also engaged in that same kind of, the exact same distinction. And that's important to keep with us. I think it's really, really important to include women, to make rules about gender balance in hiring committees and promotion committees, but that is far from being the end of the story. Okay, so that's a simulation. What would it look like to do sort of a real study? There is going to be a lot messier. One study that was done in Sweden a few years ago, a couple of researchers looked at all of the applications to get a so-called postdoctoral research position in medicine over a period of a few years. So there's a lot of variation in those CVs, and they worked really hard to find a way to compare them, and they figured that out. And I won't go into the details of that. But then they looked at the single most important thing in getting a postdoc position in academia, which is the number of articles that you've published. And then they said, okay, how many articles do men have to have on average to get a postdoc position? How many articles do women have to have on average to get a postdoc position? And it turned out that in Sweden, the bastion of gender equality, right? In Sweden, women had to have on average 2.5 times as many articles as men to be considered by a committee equally qualified with a man who was applying for the job. So that's a study based on actual data. Another example of that kind of study came out last year, looking at performance reviews in the tech industry. What kind of language is used in performance reviews, right? You know about these things. So they looked at hundreds and hundreds of performance reviews. Not surprisingly, employees were given critical feedback about their job and performance. Their bosses identified ways in which they could be better. That's great. That's what a performance review is for, right? Something like 70% of the performance reviews in that study included that kind of feedback. There was a gender difference there. About 60% of men got critical feedback, about 90% of women got critical feedback, but that's actually not the worst of it. The worst of it is the kind of feedback that came on personal issues. So some feedback was about the way you did your job, but other kinds of feedback were things like, when you speak in meetings, people say that you tend to speak very loudly. Or when you're trying to speak in a meeting, people say that you're agitated. Or other kinds of personal feedback about your personal style. About 2% of the men in this study received feedback on their personal style. Over 70% of the women received feedback on their personal style. 2 and 70. So everybody was told ways in which they could be better. Women were, in addition, told to shut up. In those reviews, here are 4 words, 4 words that appeared in the reviews of women. I'm going to ask you a question about them afterwards, so pay attention here. 4 words from the interviews of women: bossy, abrasive, strident, aggressive. Only one of those words appeared in the reviews of men. Which one was it? Aggressive, right? And that meant, of course, something different for the men than the women. That's a good thing for the boys. Okay. Now, here's what I want to say to you about these cases here. These are cases where we are treating men and women differently, which is what we're talking about today. We're talking about treating men and women differently, and in some ways we're already doing it, but we're not doing it in the ways we want to. So it's not that our starting point is that we're treating men and women the same, and we need to get someplace where we're treating them differently. That's not where we're at. we are in a place where we're treating them differently, but we're treating them differently for reasons that are largely implicit, reasons that we're largely, or we're actually largely unaware of those kinds of differences. So first we want to clean that up, and then we want to think about how to deal with the kinds of cultural issues that Aviva was talking about. And I'd like to build a little bit on something that Aviva was just discussing, namely meritocracy. So suppose you're in a company, and suppose you take implicit bias tests, and suppose you figure out that you're actually, without intending to do so, treating men and women differently, and you want to change. And maybe you think, okay, we have to stop doing this, we have to stop treating them differently, we have to figure out how to treat men and women the same. We have to figure out how to evaluate and hire based on actual performance, not on other stereotypical implicit kinds of things. We need to build in our organization a meritocracy. How are you going to do that? Well, here's also a case where research can be handy. So another study that I'll mention just briefly, and by the way, I blog about these research articles, so if you want to actually read more about those articles and find links to the original articles, then if you Google Curt Rice blog, you will come to my blog, and then you can find these things. Alternatively, you can send me a tweet and I'll answer you. Anyway, so there's a great research article called The Paradox of Meritocracy. And in that study, this is a simulation, the researchers got about 500 experienced managers to read a file on a hypothetical employee, and they said, should we give this person a raise or not? Should we promote them or not? Should we fire them? And of course, they changed the names, sometimes a man's name, sometimes a woman's name, but they did another thing too. They gave them a profile. They said, imagine you're working at a company that looks like this. Imagine that you're working at a company that has these values. And for some of the researchers, they say, the company that you're a manager at is a company that places a very high value on meritocracy. It's a company that is deeply committed to evaluating people on their performance and on nothing more. So sometimes they said that, and sometimes they said nothing about that. And I would like to read to you one sentence that the authors of that article report. They say, the main finding of our research is this: when an organization is explicitly presented as meritocratic, rewarding merit, right? Individuals in managerial positions favor a male employee over an equally qualified female employee by awarding him a larger monetary award. This is what we call the paradox of meritocracy. And in that article, they go on to discuss this, to try to explain this, and I won't have time to go into this, but there are some really weird research results out there. For example, if you have somebody going into a simulation and you first give them the opportunity to distance themselves from sexist statements. So first you have them do a questionnaire, and there's all sorts of sexist statements there, and they have to say whether they agree or disagree with those on what kind of scale. If they do that first, and if they disagree with all the sexist statements, then their performance in the project is more sexist. It's like they get their political correctness out of their system at the beginning, and then they can behave like they really are inclined to behave. But there's actually a robust literature on this. It's a really weird psychological phenomenon. But the point that I think is most relevant for us here today is that making a decision that we are going to be a meritocracy in our company, we are going to reward people on the basis of merit alone, and we're going to adopt that as a cultural value. That in and of itself might not be the way to get where you're trying to go. If that's your gender balance strategy, there's a research literature that I'd like to point you to and ask you to consider. So simply saying shape up, do better, maybe isn't going to get us there. Well, there's lots and lots to discuss about these kinds of things, and I can only give you a little taste of it. But what I'm trying to say here is that there's a big difference between treating people fairly and treating them identically. We should not put an equal sign between fairness and treating people identically. We're not up to it. We can't ignore gender when we evaluate people, and when we say that we're going to act based on merit alone, we don't seem to be able to do that either. We need help, we need interventions, we need structures in place that treat people differently in order to achieve the result of fairness. And I have to check on the time once more. 10, great, that's perfect, okay. So I'd like to tell you 2 examples from the extremes of the scale about interventions. One of those is related to that Center of Excellence story that I told you. Because the Research Council of Norway, to their credit, was very unhappy with the fact that 100% of the men at those heading those research centers, they were unhappy about the fact that 100% of the leaders of the research centers were men. And they do this competition every 5 years, and so they had some time to think about how they were going to do it differently. And they decided on what I think is probably the softest possible intervention. They wrote in the announcement, this is a serious scientific thing, and you have to be super duper world class, and blah, 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 and we're gonna have very high expectations of you. And by the way, we think it's important and natural that some of these centers would be led by women. It was not a criteria, you didn't get any points for it, it wasn't counted. They simply said, we think it's important. Well, universities in Norway think it's really important to get those centers, and they're trying to do everything they can, and the competition is very stiff, and they see that, and they think, oh, well, we've got to make sure that at least some of the applications we send in are led by women, and they do that, and the second time around, about 10% of the heads of the centers were women. Not great, but it was a step forward. And 2 years ago, we had the third round of them, and there, 25% of the heads of the centers were women, and I would wish that it were 50%, but the pool of professors in Norway is 25% women, so at least we can say that from the natural recruiting pool, there was no glass ceiling effect, that we had a pool of professors of about 25% women, and we got about 25% of the heads of centers. And that was achieved deliberately by the Research Council with that very, very soft measure. We think it's important. Okay, that's about the softest thing you can do. And then I'd like to jump over 50 other things you can do and go to the hardest thing you can do, which is real hard quotas. I don't want to argue for quotas, but I'd like to argue about quotas. And I'd like to tell you just a very quick taste from 3 different research studies on quotas. What is the biggest stereotype about quotas? The stereotype about quotas, I guess, is that when you use a quota, you hire someone who otherwise would not have gotten the job. When you use a quota, you necessarily hire somebody further down the scale because, of course, we evaluate objectively, right? So normally we would hire the best person. Now we have to go below the best person and hire the next best person. That's what we all think about quotas. If we didn't have a quota and you were best, you would have gotten the job. But the research literature, I would claim, suggests that this is exactly wrong. So here's 3 quick examples of that. First of all, from 2 research articles published in Science, which is probably the most prestigious journal in the world, published in 2011. This is based on a simulation where people simulated a hiring process. And individuals involved in that simulation could either opt in or opt out of a process. If they opted out of a process, then they were entrepreneurs and working on their own, and it was up to them alone to determine their success. If they opted in, they could get hired possibly for a job, and then they would be part of a group that had to do something, and then their success depended on the success of the group. And they looked at different ways of trying to recruit people into the group, to convince them not to go for the entrepreneurial route, but to go for the group route, which was like a hiring situation. And they experimented with different forms of affirmative action and quotas. And what they discovered is that when you include in a job announcement a statement like, all other things being equal, we'll hire a woman, or other variants on that. When you include those kinds of statements in job announcements, it affects the applicant pool. When you include that kind of statement in a job announcement, stronger women are inclined to participate in the process. When you don't include that kind of statement in the announcement, then they're more inclined to go for just relying on themselves to be entrepreneurs. in this study. So when you talk about quotas and the effect of including a statement like all other things being equal, we'll hire the woman, you can't think about the same applicant pool that you would otherwise have. That in and of itself affects the applicant pool. And in this study, it affected the applicant pool so strongly that they never actually had to use the measure. So they attracted more qualified women who then got hired, and they achieved the gender balance they were trying to achieve, not by actually using any kind of intervention in the hiring process, but rather by increasing the quality of the women who applied for the job by saying, we care about gender balance. All other things being equal, we'll hire a woman. Okay? That's one example I wanted to mention to you. The second example I wanted to mention to you has such a wonderful article that I can't get it wrong. And it's from an article that was research that was done in Sweden a couple years ago, and the article was called Gender Quotas and the Crisis of the Mediocre Man, Theory and Evidence from Sweden. The crisis of the mediocre man. This was a research article looking at political parties in Sweden, most of whom have introduced a requirement upon themselves to have lists that alternate between men and women. Every other spot goes to a man or a woman. Sometimes people call that a zipper quota. You make it like a zipper of, yeah. So, and then they figured out a way to measure the competency of the individuals who were there, and the competency of the whole group, and the competency of the group of women, and the competency of the group of men. And what was the effect of introducing zipper quotas in the political system in Sweden? The effect of introducing zipper quotas was that the competency of the overall group went up, and the competency of the group of men went up. Now think about that. What does that mean? What does it mean that the introduction of this zipper quota led to an increase in the competency of the group of men? It means that the weaker men, the less competent men, were being removed from the group and being replaced with more competent women. The introduction of more competent women led to an increase in the competency of the whole group, and the removal of the mediocre men led to an increase in the competency of the group of men. So this is an example then, a real life example, where the introduction of a quota leads not to a reduction in quality, it leads not to recruiting weaker people, it leads to recruiting stronger people and a lifting of the quality. And that's like a glass ceiling effect. So in my industry, where 40% of women, 40% of associate professors, the next highest level, are women, and 25% of full professors are women, that means that we're recruiting 75% of full professors from 55% of associate professors. So unless you believe that men are smarter than women, what that means is that the total competency of the group of full professors must be lower than the total competency of the group of associate professors, because you're only drawing from part of the pool, just like those political parties in Sweden. Okay, one more super quick, and then I will wrap up. The third one I wanted to mention is an article by some economists, and it's an article called Socially Gainful Gender Quotas from the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization. You know, I'm a linguist by training, and my life has decayed to the point where I read the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization. I'm gonna read to you one super short paragraph, 4 or 5 sentences from these guys. But they're looking, well, they say themselves what they do. So here's what they said. We study the impact of gender quotas on whether or not people apply for a promotion. They actually call that the acquisition of human capital, but that's such a weird phrase, I can't say that. So we study the impact of quotas on whether or not people apply for a promotion. In the absence of quotas, women consider their chances of getting top positions to be lower than men's. the lure of top positions induces even men of relatively low ability to engage in what they call human capital formation, that is to say, applying for those jobs. Whereas women of relatively high ability do not expect to get top positions and do not, therefore, engage in applying for promotion. Gender quotas discourage men who are less qualified, and they encourage women who are more qualified to actually apply for those jobs. So we argue in this research paper that the net result of the institution of gender quotas is an increase in the quality of the managerial staff as a whole. So those three articles, I think this is really actually very, very important, because anytime we mention quotas, we say, oh, quotas, that's a terrible thing. That necessarily means that you have you have lower quality than better quality. But actually, there's a research literature out there that challenges that view, that says both in terms of the effect that it has on the applicant pool and in terms of the effect it has on the quality of the overall group, that there are good reasons to think that quotas are actually a tool for quality enhancement. And that's a really hard thing for women to say at work, because it seems self-serving. Somehow it's easier for me to say, but it's also self-serving, because I want my organization to perform better. To hold women back, keep treating them like men. I want to tell you today that the way the current situation we're in, we do treat men and women differently, but those differences are based on implicit biases, behaviors that we're not even really aware of. And as we hear more and more about implicit bias, and as we study implicit bias, and if you've never taken an implicit bias test, by the way, and please Google Project Implicit, and you can do an online test and have your own biases revealed in a number of domains. As we become aware of implicit bias and the effects of implicit bias, then we want to correct for that. And it's tempting to think that we should correct for that by being more fair, but actually the research literature suggests that we're not very good at doing that. And maybe instead we need to correct it by treating diversity diversely. In the extreme case, one structural move would be to acknowledge the effects of quotas on women as a quality enhancement tool. So, most broadly, the message I'm trying to communicate to you is this. Your employees are different from one another. They are different at the level of individuals. They're different at the level of groups. And those differences can be described as cultural differences. And to enjoy the many well-documented benefits of diversity, you have to view cultural differences not only as legitimate, but as desirable. And to do that, you have to acknowledge that in the structures you use, structures about recruitment, about evaluation, and about promotion, that if you want to hold women back, just keep treating them like men.